Okay, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. On behalf of LASA President Margarita Lopez Maya and my LASA 2023 Program Co-Chair, Janina Welp, thank you for joining us for our second LASA Dialogue. For the 2023 Congress, we've chosen as our theme the representation and struggle for rights, and today's topic comes as part of that effort. Among the most interesting and surprising frontiers in citizen struggles in Latin America today is the fight for LGBTQ rights, which has seen some impressive advances, and this despite Latin America generally being considered a conservative region. Of course, there's also been some very significant pushback against these expansions. So, here to talk with us today, we have two leading political scientists who have followed these issues for years. Elisabeth J. Friedman is professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. She's the author of numerous articles and books, but for today, there's two edited volumes that are particularly important. Uh, First, Seeking Rights from the Left, Gender, Sexuality, and the Latin American Pink Tide came out with Duke University Press in 2019. Before that, she edited Interpreting the Internet, Feminist and Queer Counterpublics in Latin America, which came out in 2016 with the University of California Press. Javier Corrales is the Dwight W. Morrow 1895 professor of political science at Amherst College. He's a noted scholar of democracy and autocracy. In 2010, he published an agenda-setting edited volume called The Politics of Sexuality in Latin America with the University of Pittsburgh Press. And just this year, published in Cambridge Element called The Politics of LGBTQ Rights Expansion in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm going to start by asking Javier to give us sort of an overview of these uneven advances. Javier, which countries have seen the greatest advances? Which countries have seen stagnation or reaction? And sort of, if you could give us sort of a guide, a mapping of this, and sort of what are the biggest surprises in the region?
Thank you, David and Margarita, LASA President, and Janina, Co-Chair, and LASA in general for having me, and Elisabeth to talk about this. Absolutely delighted, and thank you everyone who is tuning in. All right, so the region is divided really into three categories. Most of the progress that I look at is measured in terms of legal changes and public attitudes. And the biggest changes, the best changes have been at the level of the law. And we have seen countries that are true world champions, countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia have same-sex marriage as well as many other pro-LGBTQ rights. But then outside of that category, I don't know if I'm missing one, Ecuador just recently as well. But outside of those, we see partial implementation of some of these reforms or very little implementation. So at the level of the law, we do see this variation with some countries at the forefront and others lagging behind. That said, homosexuality has been decriminalized, which is a big thing in most of the Spanish-speaking Latin America, and that's very good news. In terms of public attitudes, we still see that the public is mostly homophobic and transphobic, except in a few countries like Uruguay and Argentina. And so there has been some progress there, but we definitely have a long terrain to cover.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. One of the most interesting elements of this is how left governments such as Venezuela and Bolivia have not been leaders in this. I mean, you would think with some of the progressive discourse and rhetoric that they would be at the forefront of providing rights everywhere, but that's not the case. In fact, Elisabeth, in some of your work, you've shown that some of the left governments are distinguished by using very traditional heteronormative understandings of gender and sexuality. And so, how should we understand this? If you could give us a few examples of that, and how do we understand this? How the left has actually been sort of laggard in this?
Sure. Thanks so much, David. And I also want to extend my thanks to you and the other folks, Margarita and the LASA staff, for putting this together. It's such an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with both of you. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that the work that I'm going to speaking from through some very hard work from the collaborators from the Seeking Rights from the Left volume has been translated into Spanish and is available for download for free from Claxo. And that's such a huge benefit for us to have this research circulating in the region where it matters the most. So the 8-country comparison that we undertook across the pink tide countries revealed that ironically it was often the countries that claimed to be putting forward political projects that were the most transformative, revolutionary, leftist, that often had, as you mentioned, David, the most traditional policies with regards to gender and sexuality, or sometimes engaged in what we saw as sort of trade-offs between, for example, quotas for women's representation, but not moving forward on reproductive autonomy or on the recognition of gender identity. And so it really got to the point where we almost said that we needed to sort of reorder the ideological spectrum when it came to gender and sexuality, that it didn't fit along sort of a right-left spectrum in terms of ideas about class or the use of the state or what have you. So of course, there were a lot of contextual explanations about this, but there were 2 factors that really stood out to us to try to explain why, you know, we observe this comparative phenomenon. And one, Javier will not be surprised at all to see that it was the alliances with the Catholic Church or with evangelical forces that powerful leaders made in order to woo sort of religious leadership and followers. And another key aspect here was the, you know, relative lack of institutionalized politics, right? The very kind of sort of institutionalized democratic politics that, as Javier shows so clearly in his work, are critical to pushing sort of non-normative rights forward. Feminists have also been, you know, sort of at the forefront of democratic politics. Because the kind of pressure politics that are critical to advancing these rights rely on working across institutional venues. And when those venues are insecure, not institutionalized, not established, it's not that there can't be an opening here or there, but it's very much up to the whims of particular leaders. And it's very hard to have the kind of follow through that's needed, for example, to work on the kind of homophobia and transphobia that is the reality of so many people's lives in the region. So you asked about a specific example, and I think one of the ones that stood out the most to us was the way in which the political project of 21st century women, whose devotion to family and Chavez as their leader was, you know, really at the foundation, the sort of sine qua non of that political project. And it was very much something that was based on an assumption of a heteronormative family and women's role within that family. So many other examples, but that one stands out.
That, you know, that's one I've thought about a lot, and as I followed it from the very beginning, you know, in being a cultural sociologist, I tend to kind of think of things in terms of discourse and what occurs to me without, you know, having actually done interviews on this and a lot of research. It seems what's interesting is that, you know, in a lot of revolutionary sort of movements or left revolutionary movements, they tend to have sort of a romantic moral discourse, or a discourse that you know, they're supporting against capitalism, all that is moral, and then end up grabbing onto whatever is available and is considered moral without deconstructing it. And whereas in sort of a liberal sphere, a liberal discourse, you know, the expansion of rights beyond traditional values is something that's very much at the core of sort of liberal discourse. Is that something you see, or is that just something that I would sort of just be reading into?
Well, I think that's really interesting. And certainly when you are promoting wholesale transformation, the idea of, as you said, grabbing onto, you know, not throwing away everything that everybody believes or is used to hearing in church or, you know, in sort of popular discourse, but building on that when you're trying to at least discursively say we are going to change things dramatically. It is fascinating to me that gender and sexuality end up being those go-to comfort areas or areas of, as you said, romantic understanding, even when people are saying, let's completely change the productive apparatus. Oh, but let's leave what's going on in the home alone. And I would say that's why generally gender and sexuality rights are so challenging and often are left till the end or sort of only reluctantly sort of taken into account. I'm not so sure if it's sort of a socialist versus liberal because there are plenty of patriarchal liberals out there who, particularly the neoliberal ones, are very eager to rely on sort of unpaid labor and all of the other things that come with a traditional gender package. But the other thing that, I think we've seen, sort of continue in Venezuela and probably actually worsen is the reliance on heteronormativity and cisnormativity as well. And I was recently reading how with the sort of surveillance that has been put in place around food distribution, that it's very difficult for same-sex families to access those systems, as well as transgender individuals, because I don't think it's possible in Venezuela to get your cedula changed officially. And if you show up to get your groceries and your gender expression and identity don't match your cedula, then that makes it very complicated. So we see, again, that these sorts of trends continue.
Great, thanks. So, Javier, if we could just sort of focus in a bit for a minute. You kind of gave us an overview, and we've already touched a little bit on religion. But what is, if we could talk a little bit more about the role of religion, especially in sort of the reaction to this, religion and populism. How has this been part of the sort of reaction to these expansion in a number of countries?
I think that question goes to the core of one of the most important challenges that the struggle for LGBTQ rights has been facing, and continues to face. Let me take the question of religion first, and then I'll say something about populism, and then I'll say something about the marriage of the two. On religion, the progress that the region has made has essentially repoliticized religious conservatism in the region. Religious conservatism was a bit dormant relative to its historical presence in Latin America, basically since the 60s and through the transition to democracy. And what we are seeing is that religious conservatism has reawakened in response to the progress made. And this religious conservatism now, it's comprised of mostly evangelicals from Pentecostals, although it includes important members of the Catholic Church. So what we're seeing now in the region is the most dramatic demographic transformation in terms of religion that I think we have seen in the history of religion in Latin America since Europeans arrived. We're seeing a split between two camps. On the one side, you have the conservative religious groups, which is mostly evangelicals, and then a section of the Catholic Church, clergy and laity. That section of the Catholic Church is actually shrinking, but it's there, whereas evangelicals are growing. So that's one camp. On the other side, you have also two new groups that are they're not new in the sense of they have never existed, but they're new in that they have become each very powerful. What we call irreligious people who do not attend church or for whom religion is not a major identity, and what we call light Catholics, people who identify as Catholic but do not follow church doctrine strictly or attend church frequently. And what we're seeing is that this camp of irreligious people and light Catholics are very much on board with these new rights, social rights, and have become easy to convince, and are the sector of the population that have moved the most in terms of recognizing homophobia and transphobia and wanting to do something about it. So this is what's great news. It's sort of like the wind that is helping move forward. And again, I want to mention light Catholics are there, but they are fighting the other side of the conservatives. So that's the religious question. Now, what we're seeing is, and this is a point that Elisabeth made that I want to reiterate, autocratic populists in the region are always in need of allies because they face a lot of competition. It doesn't seem like it, but they always face a lot of competition from democratic forces. And they have discovered in the last 15 years, these autocratic populists on the left and the right, that religious conservatism is ready to be an ally for them. And this has incentivized a strange alliance that we don't see with the populism of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Now we see the emergence of political alliances between autocratic populists in the region now and evangelicals and conservative Catholics. And this is the new backlash, this combination of secular authoritarian populism working together with the conservative religious side. And make no mistake about it, conservative religious sectors in Latin America have decided to pick on issues of gender and issues of sexuality. We call it the sin that they're obsessing about the most. They are incredibly intense on making sure that there is no more progress on these fronts. They prioritize the fight against these sins far above other sins like adultery, for example. So it's very obvious that they have decided to target the fight for gender and sexual equity in Latin America.
That's super interesting what you're saying about light Catholics. And so are you saying that that as Catholics, they are sort of fighting against the Catholic conservatives, or just people that identify as Catholic but aren't really, church attenders are against what the conservative Catholics are doing and trying to roll back these rights and push against these rights?
So these are voters who go all the way from being what we might call queer allies to folks who are willing to vote for candidates who are interested in advancing rights. They're not necessarily at war with the other religious groups. That's not how they see themselves or a fight that they want to do, but they are very amenable to the expansion of these social rights. We see it throughout. We see it at all levels of politics in Latin America.
Yeah, and so because it's interesting in the U.S. Of course, religious groups, Christian groups in the U.S. and have also been sort of at the forefront of trying to prohibit same-sex marriage, the state constitution amendments. But at the same time, in the U.S., there have been religious organizations that have very much been, queer allies and have promoted from, some mainline Protestant denominations and Reformed Jewish movements have actually made this as part of their mission. Is anything like that happen that you've seen in Latin America?
We always hear about the remnants of progressivism in religious groups. Mm-hmm. We know that the Catholic Church during the Cold War had a very progressive side to it that focused on economic issues. We don't know whether that side exists also for social rights and sexuality and gender rights. We don't know. I think are about to see whether Lula in Brazil is going to make inroads with the evangelical and conservative Catholic vote in the October elections. So we are about to see an important test in Brazil. Because I really haven't seen a lot of evidence for it. I know that historically they exist, that the polls say that they are somewhere in there, that on some other issues, even the environment, you find evangelicals, for example, that are a bit progressive. But I do think that the moment you raise the issue of traditional gender norms and traditional sexuality norms, conservative religious folks tend to be very aligned with those causes.
Yeah, okay. Let me just point out that those of you who are watching can submit comments or questions or just say hello in the comment space, whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube, and we will bring those questions into our discussion. And to both Elisabeth and Javier, feel free to interrupt each other and have a free-flowing discussion, which I know is not usually our academic way, but it's certainly welcome. Okay, so thinking about this, thinking about advances but challenges as well. So Elisabeth, in your 2016 edited volume, which was fascinating, looked at how the internet changed and often facilitated feminist and queer activism. Now, a lot has happened in the past 5 years or so, 5-6 years since that came out. The internet and social media now are often seen as a threat to democracy, and a threat to expansion of rights. And I was just working with a foundation that was sort of rethinking their strategy on digital activism, and the difference between their 2012 and 2022 strategy is, 2012 was glowing, like all the possibilities of organization. 2012 was like this heavy, dour, like, what do we do? So how has this played out in this area? I mean, has this likewise been a space in which we have bots and trolls and big organizations controlling digital media, or what exactly has happened in the past 5 years in this space?
Well, I could hardly cover what exactly has happened in the last 5 years in this space. As we all sort of personally and professionally, politically experience sort of the vertiginous changes that come along with the explosion of the importance of sort of digital technology and all its very varied guises. But and of course, this is a critical question that I think, I see it cross-cutting everything else that we're talking about as well. If we think about how the various politics on the left and the right around gender and sexuality rights, have unfolded over time. The sort of digital media strategy, I remember, was critical in achieving same-sex marriage in Argentina, for example. I mean, it was very much centered by very savvy organizers who understood the potential as well as sort of the actual dynamics of that. So if I think back to the 2016 book, though, I think it's yet another sort of demonstration of the dynamism in this area, to think about sort of the particular context of the spread of the internet in Latin America. Because as many on this call probably know and have lived through, the original internet in the region, which was channeled through universities. Many of us probably remember going into the mainframe and trying to get a little access in the beginning, but also that there was a very deliberate policy within sort of civic organizations to start up their own servers, to connect them to the global network of the Association for Progressive Communications. And there was a real pro-social mission to the spread of the early internet, right? To make sure that nonprofits, that social movement actors could get access to fundamentally, but also to learn those sometimes very creaky, old dial-up modems and what have you. So from the beginning, it was really critical to progressive movement communities, nonprofits, from early on. And of course, with first commercialization and then sort of the explosion of social media development, what you see in Latin America is going to be reminiscent of other regions, with the rise of state surveillance as well as private surveillance, Of course, the explosion of disinformation, and particularly troubling along the lines that we've been, sort of discussing today, just horrific amounts of gender-based and sexuality-oriented and gender identity-oriented online violence, and an online violence that is not only violent to users who receive it online, but often, tragically has offline dimensions as well. And then, it sounds like you may have been alluding to this, David, but the all organizations are trying to sort of put their arms around this, but we've seen very savvy sort of right-wing and extreme right-wing organizing based through this technology. I just taught a piece with my undergraduates about President Bukele's millennial authoritarianism, a really nice piece in the Journal of Democracy that effectively argued that his use of social media almost constitutes a new sort of form of authoritarianism or populist authoritarianism that is cohesive and effective, right? And his branding, many of us, of course, are observing this or suffering through it, of populist and ever more militarized authoritarianism. Social media is at the center, right? The coolest dictator in the world. He puts that on Twitter, and that's supposed to, and does, rally eyeballs, clicks, if not support. But it's far from a sort of a one-sided picture. It is, yes, more confusing, a heavier load, complex to sort through, but really scratch any of the organizing that you see going on sort of to continue to promote and defend LGBTQ rights, and sort of their sort of collaborations with feminist and other sort of progressive communities. Their activism is so hybridized, it really doesn't make sense to talk about it in terms of on and offline bright line divisions. Social media is a space for consciousness raising, information dissemination, critically coalition building, and also the sort of expansion, the capacious expansion of agendas that of course has to undergird coalition building, which seems to me is sort of the critical frontier. I know we'll probably be talking a bit more about this, but in terms of resisting backlash. And it's even more important in places where cis heteronormative anti-gender ideology is on the rise, which of course is almost everywhere at this point, but is particularly fierce in certain countries, certain regions of certain countries, because that can make the face-to-face organizing, the in-person organizing difficult, if not physically dangerous. So these are arenas where sort of the study, the reality of the interpenetration of social media is critical to understand.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and
absolutely
build on some of this? Elisabeth, I don't know if you might agree with this, but I would guess that in the early part of the internet, it really served as a sort of refuge for LGBTQ folks who faced incredibly hostile environments in their public arena. And they could go to the internet, and it seems like that the internet is not fulfilling that role anymore. It continues to provide good information and bad information, but also you can discover communities. But I think people are so afraid of the internet now, and the LGBTQ community especially is very afraid, especially if they are in countries where you have the Bukeles and the Bolsonaros and these folks dominating the internet. So it's an odd change. I don't know if you would agree with that. That as a form of expressing, coming out and experimenting, mm-hmm. it's no longer so safe.
Oh, I totally agree with you that the nature of many of these spaces has transformed with the sort of the outward projection and the easy access to many of the platforms, and of course the politics and policies of those platforms that say, don't take moderation as seriously as they need to, don't act as quickly as they need when sort of these situations come up. I do still think that, in part because of the proliferation of the different applications, that there's still many really important sort of online venues for people who are, in various kinds of marginalized communities. Sort of homosocial activities through apps have exploded, as the apps do. Although you do have to be more careful, and with the sort of rise of these surveillance technologies, there's of course no guarantee the people you're talking to or swiping on are going to end up being the people that they say they are. I do think it's interesting, however, that there's still a lot of initiatives to continue to use this space, which we all live in, for organizing. Often what you see is the sort of more, what shall we say, strategic organizing that really needs to be protected against the trolls, against the sort of random kinds of online gender-based violence. You see how organizations and movements develop their own tech strategies, often with the assistance of things like the Women's Networking Support Program in APC, that has built out toolkits, that has a lot of advice and strategies for how you can sort of carve out your own piece and figure out when you're going to sort of disseminate things publicly or in public venues, and then how you're going to try your best to do things like lock down your WhatsApp chats. So, it is a more complex to be sure, and it's certainly full of dangerous neighborhoods, shall we say, and not the good kind.
I mean, maybe I now, after listening to you, I might have overstated my point, because all surveys continue to tell us that the scariest, more dangerous places for the LGBTQ community in Latin America and the Caribbean are the traditional spaces of the home, school, and work. Real life encounters, the closest encounters, the most intimate. All surveys continues to tell us that that's where the danger, the threats, the risks, the ridicule happen, and the internet continues to perhaps be the ones, as dangerous as it might be, it's still a safe haven given what we know about family life, work life, and education life.
Yeah. Well, sadly, I doubt it's not safe, but I think that's a very interesting and important set of observations that you've shared with all of us, to think about the ongoing spaces, intimate spaces for violence. And there's a real parallel there with sort of domestic violence and various kinds of gender-based violences in Latin America, which, as we know, continue at epidemic levels. And so seeing the ways in which particularly more innovative use of online technologies can, if not mediate, but be used as channels for people who are seeking safety, that's a very important place to look.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we have one question here. I have a couple more questions, but I'd like to quickly sort of go to one question that's come in from one of the viewers named Mickey. It says, how much do you think the human rights framework created post-dictatorships, or after the dictatorships, has influenced citizens and leaders' views of expanding human and civil rights for LGBTQ people? I had this question as well. I mean, sort of, where is this originally coming from? Is this coming from the pressure of LGBTQ activists, and sort of what is the discourse? Is it a human rights discourse? Is it something else?
Javier, I think you should check. You should start that one off.
Sure. The answer is multi-causal, but it is absolutely important to stress that a region that experienced authoritarianism the way that Latin America has, in many ways, perhaps a little better prepared for this new set of rights, because after authoritarianism, many countries, and courts and movements and parties in the region were so committed to making sure that they could strengthen civil rights and to not go back, that in many instances they created judicial documents and laws that definitely helped. And so, yes, it may not be coincidental that a region that was so hurt by authoritarianism up until the early 80s and into the late 80s, and try to create a set of norms and rules and expectations to try to save the region from going back, was going to provide some fertile ground for groups that will then say, well, why don't we do more than just safeguard traditional human rights? So absolutely, it played a big role, but it's sort of like, did it need to be that horrible, the experience, in order to create a fertile ground? It's the terrible thing to say at the moment. It is not the only factor. I do have to say that another aspect that has been very important for the region is transnational activism. The social movements in the region that have been leading this effort is a group that is not provincial and parochial and insular at all. This is a group that actively watches events and jurisprudence from abroad and takes good lessons from them, and so there is this notion that one could argue that this tradition of transnational activism played a big role as well. And there are many other factors, but the combination of internal experiences as well as global forces has been vital.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, sort of a unanticipated consequence of the post-dictatorship human rights framework. So here's another. This is a really good question from Martina. She says, can you expand on the partial implementation of legal changes in LGBTQ rights? Do you think some states have moved forward with hard to implement legislation with the intention of rainbow washing?
Look, I'm not that critical of rainbow washing, because if that's how we're going to get those rights, then I welcome it. I'd rather it to be insincere than not having it for homophobia. But that said, it's a very important question. By partial rights, I mean that two gold standards that we use in determining how progressive the legislation might be. One is same-sex marriage, and number two, gender identity laws. We do see that still the large majority of countries don't have those, that they might have provisions such as an anti-discrimination law. They might have legalized same-sex private activities. They might have programs to help with health crises. But we do see that Peru, Venezuela, El Salvador, Panama don't have same-sex marriage, as an example. And those are partial. Cuba, those are partial cases, because it's not the dark ages, but it's also a situation where the cases are really, you wonder what's going on. In the very beginning, David asked me if there's a country that surprises you. And I think we need to highlight Peru. Peru is a country that has experienced a lot of progress economically and politically since the 1960s. And yet Peru, when it comes to LGBTQ rights, is very behind. And we need to find out what's going on there, what is happening there, and to make sure that we pressure those countries not to stay stable where they are when the progress has been partial. So yes, there's a lot of work to be done in the majority of countries of the region.
And I just want to follow up on that with either of you. The idea of rainbow washing, I wonder to what degree that happens in Latin America, to the degree that this, as one of you mentioned previously, polls show that there's still a lot of, homophobia, transphobia. It's still in many ways sort of a conservative culture. Is this a net benefit for many politicians? I mean, would it make sense for anybody to rainbow wash on issues that aren't necessarily have widespread popularity?
You know, sorry, Elisabeth, if you were going to say something, but
No.
let me just say, the number of openly out politicians in Latin America is increasing, but it is still very low. There is an incongruence between, even in countries that are champions, very few politicians come out publicly. You do have politicians who are not out and are important supporters of this cause. But to your point, David, it seems that this is still a very risky position to embrace these causes. And when a politician does embrace this cause, I celebrate it because the allies continue to be very scarce, especially at the level where it counts the most, which is openly elected politicians. Fortunately, the panorama is changing. Even in Peru, we have openly out LGBTQ folks in elected office now, but they're very, very few. And so maybe this rainbow washing phenomenon is not a serious concern, even if it does exist in some cases and some sectors of society.
Yeah, I would say that, in general, the sector sort of sees this as a win, additional wins, and then like having rights language in constitutions can be used to then try to push forward the reality of improving the lives of people, around whom these policies are focused. I think some of the more troubling aspect of the washing is when, say, there is a notable achievement, that a leader might say, "Hey, so we've done that," and then try to wash the ongoing sort of homophobia, transphobia, and not just the phobias, but the real lived experience behind that, which is, sort of the very difficult economic situation of openly trans people, the way in which the kind of violence that's still, sort of daily directed at people with non-normative sexual or gender expression. And so I think sometimes that's where the washing part comes in, like, take out your rainbow towel and wrap that up and say, but we've done something on these rights. We have these rights in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't have to pay attention to the ongoing violation of those rights. But that's of course a place where having the laws in place or the policies in place can give proponents, a place to go, particularly in societies that fought so hard to have legal frameworks. And of course now are trying to fight hard to keep them in place, right? The sort of institutionalized democratic politics in place.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We mentioned surprising cases, and Javier, you mentioned Peru. I should just say, I find the whole thing surprising, up and down, everywhere. I mean, Venezuela, I've lived in Venezuela most of the past 30 years, and in Venezuela, I don't consider a conservative country. I mean, it has a leftist government, but even before that, it's not a conservative country generally, and socially people tend to be, centrist or sort of tend to the left, not a strong Catholic church. And virtually no progress made. I mean, you can walk around Caracas and it's very rare, unless you go to a LGBT bar or something, to see public displays of affection with same-sex couples. Whereas in the past year, I've been able to spend some time in Bogota and Mexico City. In Bogota, Colombia, one of the most conservative countries in the country. In Bogota, it's very common now to see same-sex couples holding hands. The same thing in Mexico. In Mexico, you tend to think of sort of very machista culture, and you see that. And so, I mean, it's just so non-linear, this whole process, that I find the whole thing surprising. So that's just a comment I wanted to make. There's an interesting comment here from Evie Brown, and she says Cuba is having a referendum on same-sex marriage on Sunday. Not sure if it'll pass. It's at least a second attempt, and that sort of brings to the topic of Cuba. And so we've seen in some left countries, such as Venezuela and Bolivia, have actually been laggards on these issues. What is the case in Cuba been?
You want me to start?
Yeah, but sure, either one, both of you.
So let's begin by stating a point that Elisabeth started with, that you normally see rights expanding in situations where you have significant degrees of political competition between different camps. And this is something that still doesn't exist in Cuba. In Cuba, there's only one political force, and there's very little competition. For many years, Cuba made a little bit of progress because the daughter of former President Raúl Castro, Mariela Castro, became an important ally of LGBTQ causes. And so because of her privileged position as first daughter, she had the opportunity to do some organizing and to raise the issue and create awareness. But this is what makes the Cuban case so shocking. You would think that if the issue of gender and LGBTQ is the flagship issue of the daughter of the dictatorship, and yet the progress has been so scant, how bad are things? How strong is the patriarchy in Cuba? Also, it's a country where the churches are the weakest, are absolutely the weakest. So my argument about the religious conservatism being a veto player, exists to some extent in Cuba, but we know that the Cuban government doesn't necessarily pay attention to the church. So there is a significant degree of persistence of the patriarchy in Cuba, but more important, going back to a point that Elisabeth made, you need a political system where the most important actors believe in pluralism and the extension of rights. And I don't think the Cuban regime believes in the extension of rights. It feels that only within the revolution, it's okay to have a few rights. Outside the revolution, of course, nothing. And they're very, very scared. Finally, I think the LGBTQ community and human rights experts around the world should not look with good eyes moments when states decide that they're going to determine the rights of minorities by way of majority processes like referendum and plebiscite. Sometimes it works, as in Taiwan and as in Ireland, but for the most part, this is an incredibly dangerous way to deal with the rights of marginalized communities. Ask the majorities, the conservative majorities, whether they approve it or not. And so I don't have much that I can say to celebrate about how Cuba has handled LGBTQ rights.
Okay. So sort of as a last round of questions, I want to look at the future of this. And as we all know, the recent history in the U.S. has shown that even Roe v. Wade, after a half century, can be overturned. Rights can go backwards, and I think that's been implicit in our whole discussion. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of this, and in particular, Elisabeth, you've studied the movements in particular that are behind this. Javier studied more sort of the politics of it, and you studied the movements. Could you tell us a bit about sort of the intergeneration and intra-generational cooperation, the differences among movement participants now and sort of moving forward?
Sure, although I would not say that Javier doesn't study the movements, because his insights on movements have been so, I mean, I think he studies the whole picture. And one thing that just always stands out from his work that, sort of really dovetails with your question here is, going through each factor, each institutional factor, and, sort of degrees of religiosity and whatnot, but that over and over again, the power of a particular branch of government or a particular institutional factor really does key off of the power of the movement, the power of mobilization. And so it's very much, sort of the outcomes are very interactive. And of course, Javier is always very clear about the complexity of the achievements. And also, I think one thing you're asking us to, to think about here are some of the setbacks. And I do think Javier mentioned earlier the importance of sort of transnational influences in the region, and something that we've thought about a lot with regards to movement development are precisely those kinds of linkages. They also, particularly as being wielded against LGBT movements and also feminist movements in the region, that those extra regional or even sort of extra national connections were seen by the opposition as imposition, foreign funding, imperialism, imperialist ideas that are brought into the region that don't really accord with its culture. And I think that analysis takes on even sort of more interesting weight here as we see the extra regional influences on the anti-gender movements that are sweeping and have been sweeping across the region, where they never say this is an imperial imposition, right? They don't say, that this is an agenda that is literally being funded from the United States. That you see the circulation of the sort of con mis hijos, no te metas, right? That's actually now a global term, hands off the kids, that has been very much promoted by right-wing evangelical movements with capacious pockets out of the United States and has spread globally, not just in Latin America. But in any case, sort of thinking about that transnational linkage is critical when we observe the sort of the pushback that, as you say, David, has become very strong in Latin America, sort of around this constellation of rights that fits in, sadly, quite beautifully with populist authoritarian focus on reestablishing sort of these stable nations on the basis of our age-old traditional gender and, effectively heterosexuality values, right? Those are Hispanic values going all the way back, or they're deeply rooted in our Latin American tradition. And so that is quite the sort of obstacle that movements are facing. I haven't looked so much at sort of intergenerational cooperation and generational shifts in LGBT movements per se. So Javier may have more to say here. But what I have seen from the really amazing explosion of work that's been coming out around sort of anti-gender-based violence movements and pro-abortion movements in Latin America is the critical role that's being played by an explosion of younger activists in these movements. And one of the, I think, key differences, or perhaps not differences, but something that they've put forward so strongly is that they do not see a separation among these issues. Right, the sort of the conceptualization of reproductive rights and sort of gender identity rights and the right to have a life free from violence regardless of your identity is something that this sort of, in the US we would say deeply intersectional values of this generation has put at the forefront. But one thing that's very interesting about the sort of newer generations is a lot of them also reject some of the very institutionalized politics that has been so successful, particularly in the sort of the boom of sort of rights acquisition that Javier writes about so cogently in his newish book. And so I think there's some really interesting sort of sorting out to do there, because if you reject the institutional side, which you may well because you feel excluded by it, what does that mean in terms of sort of pinning the rights down into legislation and policy going forward? So it seems like they have a sort of a different institutional orientation as well. And of course, wonderfully dramatic repertoires of action.
Great. Wow, super interesting. The and then one last question. We're trying to keep this at one hour for Javier. Now, you've written a lot about most of your analysis has been about political competition, strength of courts, existing legislation, and how it can be used. And sort of implicit in that is that it hasn't been like a groundswell of cultural change. It's been something that some activists have been able to do given the politics of their national context. And then you sort of analyze the reaction to this and the building reaction. And so I want to ask you something that Elisabeth sort of touched on now is what do you think? I mean, what do you think about these sort of legal changes generating cultural change? I mean, do you think that this could have a transformative impact in the region? We know it's generated a reaction, but do you think it also has a transformative impact culturally in favor of this or not?
The evidence that I have seen is telling us that this experiment in Latin America, and the experiment consists of moving the laws, making them far more progressive than where society is. In other words, not wait until society is ready, but moving the laws first, actually has both great effects as well as negative effects. Where you move the law significantly, typically this occurs after quite a bit of debate and discourse and information. And we do see that when you make significant legal changes and go through that process, the size of the population that becomes more accepting of non-heteronormative positions expands. We totally see it in Argentina, we see it in Chile, we see it in Uruguay. So this is worth the effort. It does produce effects. But it also radicalizes the opposition to it. The opposition to it may shrink demographically. We do see that, but they come out as more aggressively homo and transphobic. And so we see that in many ways it changes the field a little bit. It adds force to the progressive sides, but it also doesn't debilitate the resistance. So what can I say? Yes, I'd rather live in a country where the majority of the population is aware of the need to fight homophobia and transphobia. And this is something that can result from wanting to engage in the debates that are necessary to change the law, even when society wasn't ready.
Okay, well, thank you. With that, I think we're going to end here. Thank you both so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think we could talk for another hour. And thank you for those who have watched. You know, this will actually be almost immediately on LASA's page and will be able to be viewed there forever. So if you participated and liked the discussion, please tweet it, retweet it, and show your friends, bring it to your classes and your activities. And we appreciate your support. So thank you very much.